What happens when a loyal companion, a protector who once stood strong and fearless, is suddenly cast aside in his final years? Can a dog who spent nearly 2 decades in service, who once ran with pride and purpose, truly understand the pain of abandonment? And what if, in his darkest moment, when all hope seems lost, when each passing day feels colder than the last, someone finally looks past his age and sees the heart that still beats beneath his weary frame? Sarah Bennett never intended to adopt a dog that day. Yet when she locked eyes with Duke, something deep inside her stirred. Could saving him heal the wounds she carried? Could two broken souls, both grieving the ones they lost, find solace in each other? And in the end, does love have the power to defy time itself? Before we continue this story, let us know where you are watching from. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. Duke was 19 years old, a German shepherd who had once stood tall, proud, and unwavering in his devotion to the people he considered his family. But after nearly 2 decades of loyal service, everything he knew had been ripped away. His muzzle had grayed, his legs had weakened, and his spirit had dulled to a point where he no longer lifted his head to meet the strangers who passed by his cage. At the Montana Haven Animal Shelter, Duke blended into the background, a silent presence among barking puppies and energetic young dogs who had no shortage of admirers. The shelter's corridors echoed with constant noise. Bright-eyed dogs wagged their tails, hoping a visitor might pick them. Puppies clambered over one another in a bid for attention. The crisp Montana air seeping in through the thin walls made the place feel colder than it looked. At the far end of this cacophony, Duke's kennel sat in near silence. Day after day, volunteers walked by with hesitant glances, sighing at his condition. At first, he would lift his ears just barely, maybe flick his tail in greeting. Over time, even that hope had faded. He lay there, a shadow of the strong dog he once was. Emma, a young volunteer, did her best to care for him. She would speak gently, sometimes bringing over special treats. Yet, no matter how many times she tried, Duke's gaze rarely moved from the corner where he curled up. He drank little and ate even less. Greg, the shelter owner, found it heartbreaking but had almost resigned himself to an outcome no one wanted to voice. The look in Duke's eyes told a story of betrayal. His family had walked away, and he sensed they weren't coming back. Animals could feel such things more keenly than people realized. One late afternoon, a newcomer stepped into the shelter. Her name was Sarah Bennett. She didn't arrive with the intention of adopting a dog. In fact, she had stayed away from the shelter for over a year. She once volunteered with her husband Jake, weekends spent walking dogs, fostering puppies, and bringing a semblance of home to those without one. But Jake's passing had left her reeling, and for many months, she could hardly bear the thought of returning to a place filled with reminders of love and loss. That day, something drew her in. Maybe it was a whisper in her quiet house that reminded her she was alone. Maybe it was the memory of Jake and how he always smiled when they were around animals. Whatever it was, she felt compelled to drive to Montana Haven Animal Shelter. She walked past rows of lively dogs, each one vying for her attention with happy yips. Yet her steps slowed the instant she spotted an aged German shepherd in a far corner. Sarah paused by Duke's cage. Unlike the other dogs, he made no move to greet her. His muzzle was frosted white with age, his coat patchy and dulled, and his eyes filmed with a cloudy weariness. She couldn't tear her gaze away. It was as though she recognized something in him that tugged at her own sorrow. Kneeling beside the chain-link door, she murmured softly, "Hey, buddy," but Duke didn't stir. Emma approached and gently placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "His name is Duke," she said, her voice heavy. "He's been here for 6 months, but no one wants to take him. He's 19, and he barely reacts anymore." Sarah's heart twisted. 19 years is a long time," she whispered. Greg walked up behind them, folding his arms across his chest. His family said they couldn't handle him, claimed he was too old. It's a sad truth that older dogs rarely catch anyone's eye. Sarah looked again at Duke. watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Something flickered in her mind, a memory of Jake's final days, when she had sat by his side, unwilling to leave him even as he slipped away. Abandonment in the face of age and frailty was something she could never comprehend. She tightened her grip on the kennel door. "Has anyone thought about taking him home?" she asked quietly. Kayak. "A few people met him, but he's shutting down. Most potential adopters want a dog they can train or play with, not one that might pass away at any moment." Sarah took a breath, her throat tightening. Duke didn't deserve to finish his life in a cold cage. She felt a surge of resolve well up inside her, the first spark of real determination she'd experienced in a while. "I'll take him," she said. Emma's eyes went wide. "Are you sure? He needs a lot of care. He's hardly eating anymore." Sarah lifted her chin. "I'm sure. Even if it's just for a little while, I won't let him spend one more day feeling like nobody cares. Not after everything he's been through." She reached for the latch, and Duke finally turned his head. Their eyes met for just a second, a fragile, unspoken moment that felt like a promise. For the first time in months, he saw someone who truly looked back at him with empathy rather than pity. And in that fleeting moment, Duke's life changed forever. Signing the adoption paperwork felt surreal to Sarah. She wasn't sure she had the emotional energy to care for someone else after losing Jake. Yet, as she scribbled her name, an undercurrent of purpose coursed through her veins, an echo of who she used to be. Emma handed her the final sheet with a hopeful smile, but Greg couldn't hide the worry etched into his features. "You know he might not have long," Greg cautioned quietly, holding the door open as Sarah guided Duke toward her car. "He could slip away tonight, or next week, or—" Sarah nodded. "I understand," she said softly, glancing at Duke, who moved with tremors in his legs. "But he won't go through it alone." Getting Duke in her car was its own small battle. He seemed disoriented, as though he couldn't quite trust his legs to climb onto the back seat. With gentle coaxing and a supportive lift, Sarah settled him into a blanket she'd brought along. The drive home was silent. Duke lay motionless, eyes half closed, seemingly resigned to another uncertain change of scenery. Every so often, Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror, her chest tightening each time she checked for signs of breath. Night had fallen by the time they arrived at Sarah's house, a modest home nestled at the end of a quiet street. She had left the outside light on, its glow flickering against the darkening sky. Carefully, she lifted Duke again, feeling just how light he was beneath that thick fur. Every rib, every joint, felt sharp under her hands. Inside, the house felt eerily still. It struck Sarah how much she had avoided this space, the physical embodiment of the life she once shared with Jake. Setting Duke down on a plush dog bed near the fireplace, she felt an ache in her heart. She draped a soft blanket over him, realizing he was already drifting off. In the hushed glow of the living room lamp, she noticed how clouded his eyes were, how each breath seemed like an effort. Shaking off a swell of emotion, Sarah went to the kitchen. She heated some broth and mixed it with soft kibble. The smell filled the small home, reminding her of simpler days when she would prepare meals while Jake hummed in the background. She returned to the living room and set the bowl gently in front of Duke. "Here you go, bud," she said softly. "Just try a little." He lifted his head, just barely, and sniffed. But he didn't drink or eat. His gaze slipped from the bowl to somewhere distant. A pang shot through Sarah. She recognized that look, a gaze fixed on emptiness, on loss. It was a reflection of her own heartbreak, the same hollowness she saw in the mirror on her worst days. She leaned back, crossing her legs, trying not to sob. "It's okay," she whispered, mostly to herself. "We'll figure it out." Exhaustion tugged at her eyes as midnight approached. She couldn't quite bring herself to leave Duke alone in a strange new place on his first night. Instead, she curled up on the couch, half watching him under the soft lamplight. Every slow movement he made seized her attention, but mostly he was still. At some point, her thoughts blurred into a dreamless doze. In the quiet early hours, a sound roused her. She blinked, disoriented, the orange embers in the fireplace now barely aglow. Duke wasn't in his bed. Her heart lurched. She stood quickly, scanning the dim room. Then she saw him, standing rigid in the hallway. He was staring at a framed photograph of Jake that hung on the wall, captured in a moment of laughter from years ago. Duke seemed transfixed, his head tilted ever so slightly, eyes locked on the photo as though he recognized something about it. Sarah approached slowly, her pulse quickening. "Duke," she murmured. He didn't move except for a faint flick of his ear. His gaze stayed on the picture, and in that stillness, he let out a low, trembling whimper. Sarah's breath caught. He hadn't uttered a sound since she first saw him at the shelter. But here he was, voicing something that might have been sadness, confusion, or a memory pulled from a place he had buried deep. She knelt beside him, reaching out to place a hand lightly on his back. Her mind spun with questions. Why would Duke react to Jake's photograph? A man he had never met? It was as though the image of someone who had also disappeared from life struck him on a level beyond words. For a while, they both remained there, Sarah, caught between comfort and grief, Duke, enveloped in silent echoes of a life that was gone. Finally, she guided him back to his bed and gently covered him again. He settled with a tired sigh, but that small whimper lingered in her thoughts long after he fell asleep. Sarah settled on the couch once more, eyes locked on the quiet figure by the fireplace. She had no idea how long he would remain in her life, but in that moment, she vowed to make whatever time he had left matter. Sleep eventually claimed her. Yet an unspoken bond had begun taking shape between a grieving woman and a dog who had been discarded by the world. Morning light filtered through the curtains, a soft glow that revealed Duke lying awake on his bed. His eyes tracked Sarah as she rubbed the sleep from her face. She forced a small smile, heart quickening at the realization that he seemed more alert than the night before. She walked to the kitchen, not wanting to spook him with words. Maybe if she acted normal, just going about her routine, he'd feel safe enough to trust her presence. A moment later, she heard the tentative sound of paws behind her. Duke had followed her. The progress was slight, but hope bloomed in her chest as she prepared another bowl of soft kibble. This time, she decided to warm it with chicken broth again, hoping the aroma might entice him. When she sat on the floor, Duke sniffed carefully. After what felt like forever, he took one small bite, then another. Relief coursed through Sarah's veins as she knelt there, watching him eat. It wasn't much, but each mouthful felt like a victory. As days passed, Duke's transformation was agonizingly slow but unmistakable. He would wander from the living room to the kitchen, pausing to observe Sarah as though measuring her trustworthiness. He would make soft eye contact when she called his name, and sometimes, if she sat quietly next to him, he would rest his chin on her knee for a moment before shifting away. She understood how delicate this trust was, like a thin thread that could break at any time. Driven by curiosity and the desire to help him heal, Sarah decided she needed to know more about Duke's past. All the shelter records indicated was the name of the family who had brought him in. She called Greg at Montana Haven Animal Shelter, explaining her plan. He hesitated, reminding her that those people hadn't shown any kindness in Duke's final years. But Sarah felt a stubborn determination that wouldn't let her rest until she at least tried to learn what had happened. One weekend, she pulled up to the address listed on the papers. The house was imposing, large, with a wide porch and meticulously groomed shrubs. The door was answered by a neatly dressed woman in her early 60s, her expression turning rigid when Sarah mentioned Duke's name. The woman invited her in with a cold politeness, calling out to someone in the living room. A tall, gray-haired man emerged, his face carved by lines of age, but also, Sarah noticed, by regret. She explained who she was. "My name is Sarah Bennett. I adopted Duke from the shelter. He's still alive," she added, letting the words hang in the silence. They exchanged stiff looks. Then the man exhaled, shoulders drooping. "So you're the one who took him," he said, almost in a whisper. "I wasn't sure anyone would." Sarah swallowed her anger, steadying her tone. "Why did you leave him? He was part of your family for 19 years. The woman rolled her eyes. But the man's gaze flickered with shame. He wasn't always a regular pet, he said. Duke used to be my partner. Back then, his name was Shadow. He was a K9 when I worked in law enforcement. A ghost of a smile curved his lips. He was fearless, the best partner I ever had. Stunned, Sarah felt her heartbeat quicken. Then why? He cut her off with a pained sigh. He got old. Started missing steps, forgetting commands. It hurt to watch him deteriorate. We tried to make it work, but eventually, I just couldn't do it anymore. Seeing him so weak, it was too hard. A flush of anger and sorrow rose within Sarah. You say you loved him like a partner, yet you left him alone in a shelter. Don't you think he was hurting too? Don't you think he needed you more than ever? The man's jaw tightened. You don't understand. A K9 like Shadow. He was unstoppable in his prime. I couldn't handle seeing the dog I knew turning into a frail version of himself. Sarah's voice trembled with outrage. That's exactly when he needed you the most. And you walked away. The woman looked impatient, clearly wanting the conversation to end. If you've come to judge us, you can leave now, she said. Sarah took a shaky breath, chest tight with sadness and disbelief. She glanced at the man. He still got life left in him. You gave up on him, but I won't. She left without looking back, her emotions colliding in her head. So Duke had a history as a K9 officer. It explained his quiet vigilance, his almost soldier-like discipline, even in old age. She also realized how much more deeply his abandonment must have cut him. He'd been trained to serve and protect, yet was discarded the moment he became inconvenient. Driving home, Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She glanced at the passenger seat, wishing Jake were there to share her outrage, to remind her that love doesn't vanish when things get hard. Pulling into her driveway, she brushed away those tears. Duke was waiting for her inside, and that was all that mattered now. She wouldn't fail him the way his former handler had. That evening, as Duke rested by the flickering fireplace, Sarah gently stroked the fur along his neck. Your name used to be Shadow, huh? She murmured. His ears twitched slightly, though he didn't lift his head. Well, Duke suits you too. You're safe here. She felt him breathe in a slow, measured rhythm. For a fleeting second, she thought she caught a glimpse of acceptance in his weary eyes. Sarah's discovery about Duke's past ignited a new level of determination in her. She began noticing the small markers of his training that still lingered. The way he snapped to attention whenever she opened a door, or how he would react subtly to certain noises on television, as though waiting for a command that never came. The knowledge that he had once been a proud K9 named Shadow made her ache for what he'd lost, and for what he could still regain. In the following days, she tried to coax out more of that old spirit, sometimes using basic commands. But Duke remained guarded. He would tilt his head as though her voice sparked a memory, but he never fully responded. Nonetheless, he followed Sarah from room to room, his presence a quiet shadow. Often, she'd catch him staring at Jake's photograph in the hallway. She couldn't explain it, but he seemed drawn to that image. As winter weather closed in, Duke's health wavered. He had good days, trotting slowly around the living room, nosing at Sarah's hands for attention. On other days, he would curl up and refuse to eat, his body trembling in a silent struggle. Sarah made frequent calls to Dr. Whitaker, the local vet who specialized in geriatric care. She kept hoping Duke's resilience would outlast these spells of frailty. Then, one frigid morning, Sarah woke to Duke whimpering in pain. Rushing to his side, she found him shaking so badly he could hardly stand. His eyes were clouded over more than usual, and panic coursed through her veins. She bundled him in a warm blanket and sped to the vet's office, heart thundering with fear that she might lose him before they even arrived. Dr. Whitaker ushered them into an exam room, calmly checking Duke's vitals. After what felt like an eternity, he stepped back with a somber expression. He's in a precarious state, the vet explained softly, laying out the possible causes: advanced arthritis, kidney issues, the general toll of age. At 19, any crisis can become life-threatening. Sarah's eyes brimmed with tears she fought to keep back. What can we do? Dr. Whitaker folded his arms, looking at the dog who lay limply on the exam table. We can try medication, fluids, pain management. But you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that he may not bounce back. Sometimes the kindest thing is letting them go. The words sliced into her. Sarah looked at Duke, remembering the day she found him in that shelter cage. How she'd promised he wouldn't be alone anymore. "I can't just give up," she whispered. "Not when he's come so far." The vet nodded sympathetically. "We'll do everything we can." That night was one of the longest of Sarah's life. She stayed up watching over Duke, administering small doses of medication to ease his discomfort. Every hour, she offered him water, gently lifting his head when he was too weak to move. The storm outside battered the windows with gusting winds, and the power flickered once or twice, plunging the room into near darkness. In those moments, Sarah clung to Duke's side, a solitary figure comforting a dog who had once known only duty. By dawn, a fragile calm had settled. Duke opened his eyes, and though he was clearly exhausted, he was still with her. Sarah felt her heart surge with relief. She'd been bracing for the worst, imagining she might wake to a cold, still body. Instead, he let out a soft exhale, and his gaze met hers with a hint of recognition. She gently caressed his head, tears slipping free at last. In the following days, Sarah's life centered on Duke's recovery. She cooked specialized meals and fed him by hand. She massaged his legs, following Dr. Whitaker's advice on gentle physical therapy. Each small sign of improvement, like a tail wag or a delicate attempt to stand, fueled her resolve. But the process was taxing, dredging up memories of caring for Jake when he was sick, the nights spent in hospital rooms, the relentless battle they eventually lost. Yet this was different in a crucial way. Duke's eyes hadn't lost all hope. A faint spark lingered, reminding Sarah that as long as he was trying, she had to try too. She found herself talking to him, sharing memories of Jake, confessions of her own fears and regrets. Perhaps it was foolish, but she believed Duke understood more than people would guess. His quiet presence soothed the shards of her own heart in a way she hadn't felt since her husband's passing. Weeks passed, and Duke's strength began to rally. The medication and the extra care stabilized him. Though he was still frail, the trembling grew less frequent. He started to take a few more steps each day, navigating the house with measured caution, pausing to rest when he needed to. Sarah learned to read his signals, how to support him without making him feel helpless. Love and patience, she discovered, were powerful forces, even for a dog who seemed on the brink of giving up. One evening, as soft snow fell outside, Sarah curled up on the floor beside Duke's bed. Gently stroking his ears, she reminded him, "You're safe here, Duke. You can stay as long as you want." His gaze drifted from her to the flickering shadows on the wall, then back again. Slowly, he nudged her hand with his muzzle. It was the most deliberate show of affection he had offered yet, and Sarah felt an unexpected lump in her throat. Jake would have loved this dog, she thought with a pang. In a way, she felt as if the three of them were bound by invisible threads of loss and healing. Duke's recovery didn't happen overnight, but every small step forward felt like a triumph. On some mornings, Sarah would open the back door to find him eagerly waiting, as though he wanted to venture outside, just to sniff the crisp Montana air. His legs remained unsteady, but his courage was greater than any physical limitation. She'd walk slowly beside him, giving him time to explore tiny patches of yard, taking in scents only his nose could decipher. Her home began to transform around him. Rugs were laid out on slippery floors to aid his footing. Soft beds appeared in several rooms, so he'd always have a cozy place to rest near her. Medications were neatly lined up in the kitchen, side by side with sticky notes detailing feeding times and dosages. Through each tedious routine, Sarah felt her bond with Duke grow stronger, as though they were quietly teaching each other how to heal from heartbreak. Curiosity still tugged at her mind about his previous life as Shadow. Had he saved lives? Captured criminals? Earned accolades? She realized she might never know the full story. What mattered now was that he was hers to protect, and she wanted to give him all the peace he deserved. Sometimes she would see a glimmer in his cloudy eyes, like an echo of that brave canine he used to be, but then his legs would shake or his breath would catch, reminding her he was an old dog living in borrowed time. One day, Sarah decided to place a small photo of Jake on the low table near Duke's bed. She wasn't sure why. Exactly. Maybe because Duke had once been so captivated by Jake's image in the hallway. She set it down and stepped back. Duke lifted his head, studying the photo with a soft tilt. He didn't whimper this time. Instead, his expression seemed strangely calm, as though he was silently acknowledging a friend he'd never met. Sarah's heart clenched with a bittersweet feeling that words couldn't capture. Late one afternoon, Sarah was in the kitchen making tea when she heard shuffle. She turned to see Duke padding in, head held higher than usual. He approached her, his tail wagging, slow and somewhat wobbly, but definitely wagging. She couldn't contain the joy that bubbled up. Stooping down, she wrapped her arms around his frail frame, pressing her cheek against his fur. Duke let out a low rumble, almost like a purr, accepting her embrace. That moment felt like a victory not just for him, but for both of them, two souls who had faced loss and chosen to keep living anyway. Greg and Emma stopped by one weekend to check on Duke. The transformation astounded them. Gone was the dog who lay listless in a cage, who refused food and human touch. Now he greeted them quietly, even allowing Emma to scratch behind his ears. Greg's voice broke as he muttered, "I never thought I'd see him like this again." Emma nodded, tears brimming. "You gave him a home," she said to Sarah, "and he found a reason to stay." Despite the progress, reality remained ever present. Duke was 19, and no amount of love could change that. Some days, he had trouble getting up, and Sarah would sit beside him, stroking his fur, reminding him that it was all right to rest. Each breath he took felt like a gift. Each day, another chance to offer him the life he deserved. She tried not to dwell on the looming possibility of losing him. Instead, she poured her energy into the now, into this quiet partnership built on mutual resilience. Over time, the nightmares that once haunted Sarah's sleep began to fade. She dreamed less of hospital rooms and grief, focusing instead on the simple joys of everyday life. Making breakfast while Duke watched her curiously, catching rays of morning sunlight that lit up the dust motes in the living room. Hearing the soft jingle of Duke's collar as he followed her through the house. She had found purpose again in caring for a dog that everyone else had discarded. There came a day when, while watching Duke doze by the window, Sarah realized she wasn't just fulfilling a promise to him. She was also honoring Jake's memory in a roundabout way, continuing to love and to care, even when it hurt. Duke lifted his gaze, as if sensing her thoughts, and she smiled at him with watery eyes. Life was fragile, but it was also precious. In the end, Duke had taught her that it wasn't about how much time remained. It was about what you did with every day you still had. And so, Duke lived on, proving that with the smallest spark of hope, even the most abandoned soul could find the strength to carry on. He had been a canine warrior, a family dog, and finally, a friend and companion who reminded one grieving woman that love can heal even the deepest wounds. His steps might falter, his eyes might be cloudy, but Duke's spirit was far from broken. With Sarah by his side, he knew he was home, forever. Duke's story reminds us that devotion and love should never be overshadowed by age or circumstance. He was once a formidable K9 named Shadow, dedicating his life to serving and protecting. Later, he became the loyal family dog who was eventually cast aside when his body grew frail. Yet, in the darkest moment of his abandonment, one person stepped forward to show him that compassion does not have an expiration date. Sarah's decision to adopt Duke was born from her own grief and longing for connection. By offering him care, she also found a way to heal herself. The road they traveled together wasn't easy, marked by painful discoveries, setbacks, and moments when giving up would have been simpler. But in the end, their bond proved stronger than the hardships they both endured. Love, patience, and respect for one another's scars guided them to a place where trust could flourish. Their journey highlights a profound truth. No creature is ever truly beyond saving if given the opportunity to feel valued again. Duke might not have lived another decade, but every day he spent in Sarah's home mattered. It was a chance for him to know genuine care and a reminder to Sarah that loss, no matter how deep, does not have to be the end of one's capacity to love. In giving Duke his final chapter of peace and belonging, Sarah discovered a renewed purpose in her own life. Ultimately, Duke's story stands as a testament to resilience. It shows that even when we feel most broken, the simplest act of kindness can light the way forward. No life is too old, too tired, or too wounded to be touched by hope, and sometimes hope is all it takes to begin again.